Hi, this is Anna Levaya, and this is my research topic on textile manufacturing and the impact on the environment. This paper really is kind of an expansion on the book report that I read for the dirty side of the garment industry. Being that I'm in apparel manufacturing, this topic was very interesting to me because it's something that I deal with every day, but have never really looked at in terms of the environmental impact that the industry that I work in creates. This paper that I wrote goes over an overview of textile manufacturing, consumer purchasing, and the impact that the consumer has on the environment. As well as why the apparel industry is considered a major industrial polluter, and as well as what consumers should understand about their buying power and the impact that it has on the environment. The first kind of section of my paper really goes over how fast fashion came about. And to kind of recap, fast fashion is product that is very low cost. It's meant to be very replaceable. Consumers are buying it not out of necessity, but more of that it's at a low price point and they can afford it. It's trend driven, and the trends typically change every couple of weeks, so stores are constantly replenishing product. Big kind of offenders of fast fashion are going to be your discount retailers like Target. You're also going to have Zara, H&M, Charlotte Russe, Rue 21. Any of those kind of junior targeted stores are going to be considered fast fashion. What the second kind of portion goes into is more about cotton and individual fibers and the impact that they have on the environment. As I kind of alluded in my other presentation, cotton is a fairly important fiber in the apparel industry. It is probably one of the single most important fibers for production. The earliest known use goes back 7,000 years. And it wasn't until after the Industrial Revolution until individuals really started making cotton kind of a mainstay of their production. Prior to that, primary fibers that were used were wool and flax. One of the reasons why cotton is so important to consumers is because it's very durable. It dries quickly. It is got good dye affinity. It maintains its strength when wet. It reduces bleeding or fading. It has great wash fastness properties for the customers. It's also cheaper to manufacture than when you look at compared to synthetic fibers like polyester or nylon or spandex. What was interesting that I found is that 50% of the world's textile production is comprised of cotton, and 38% of the total world fiber market is cotton. Cotton, though, is very hard to produce. It is harsh on the environment. You need a high output of water or high water usage in order to grow the crop. One shirt can require 2,700 liters of water to manufacture, and this is roughly what one individual drinks in about 2 years. So high volumes of water going in only to just grow the product. There's also a lot of chemicals used in stripping the leaves and the seeds from the actual plant itself, and these actually seep into the groundwater as well. It also has a high amount of pesticides used. One of the interesting kind of facts that I learned was that 2.5% of the world's cultivated land use is used for cotton in the entire world. Out of that, 16% of the world's insecticides are used on this one crop, which is more than any food product crop that is currently grown. One of the things about fabric is that it all kind of starts out in the same form. It starts out at what they call grayish goods. Grayish goods are typically white or yellow in color, and with cotton, and what grayish goods really are is it's just fabric in its raw form. It's not been dyed, it's not been cleaned, it's not been finished, it's just been either knit or woven into a piece of fabric on a bolt. And all of this has to be prepared for dyeing and printing. It goes through bleaching, it goes through detergents, enzymes, optical brighteners. It also goes through something called mercerization, which essentially is a series of sodium hydroxide baths. The product is kind of run through all these baths, and what that does is it really takes off kind of the excess fiber It makes it very, it improves the hand. It increases the dye affinity because it causes the cellulosic section of the cotton plant, which kind of looks like a bean. It causes that bean to kind of swell open, and more dye gets infused into the center of the plant, thereby taking color better. The other kind of process that's used in manufacturing of the grayish goods is something called singeing. It is used with natural gas and open flame, and the fabric's actually passed over this kind of open flame to reduce the fuzziness in the fibers, so the fibers are actually burned off. So there's a lot of kind of processes that kind of go into even before you can dye and finish the product. One of the interesting things about all the chemicals used in textile dyeing and printing is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, meaning that there is no one fabric or fiber that can take all dyes or inks, and there's no one ink solution for all fabrics. So it makes kind of the textile manufacturing process very complex. Dyes are generally synthetic. We don't really have any natural-based dyes anymore, so you have a lot of chemicals going into kind of the water and the processing when you're going through the dyeing and finishing process. Dyes fabrics, depending on what they are, take dyes differently. Polyester, for example, is a very hydrophobic, meaning it repels the water. When you work with polyester, they require more dyes at a higher temperature, so you're using more resources to heat the water, and you also have more water that has to be used to rinse the product. Cotton, for example, or protein-based fibers like silk or wool, they are cellulosic or protein-based, so they require less dye at a lower temperature. So depending on the fiber you're working with, it can also vary with how much effluents are getting released into your wastewater. That's why, treating for cleaning up the water that's being washed out is very difficult. You can't clean all of these chemicals and all these processes out of the water. So water coming out of these textile dyeing and finishing plants is extremely polluted. It has a lot of chemicals in it. And you may not be able to see those because all the textile plants are required to do is to remove the color from the dye. One of the things I looked at is synthetic, organic, and recycled, and how this really isn't an answer to the solution. As I kind of mentioned in my last presentation, since I've been working in the industry for a while, one of the really big things that we will get young kids coming out of college is they want to use sustainable, and they want to use recycled fabrics, and they want to go organic. And this is a very complex issue in itself. Synthetic fibers have increased in the market over the last 10 years. That's primarily because the customer is requiring that products have that wash fastness. They want them to stretch. They want them to be easy to care for, easy to wear. They don't want them to wrinkle. So we've required a lot of things as consumers that are kind of driving this synthetic fabric. Polyester is the largest fabric in terms of market share when you look at synthetics. Customers like it because it has good wash fastness properties. It dries quickly. It does not wrinkle. The color maintains it. It's got low shrinkage. In a report that I was reading from the European Union, it cites that 16% of the fibers used in the EU is polyester, and that encompasses 55% of the world's textile market. The U.S. is the largest consumer of polyester, so we're obviously using more than 16%. It's just that the EU countries tend to use a lot more cellulosic-based fibers. The problem with polyester is that it's made from fossil fuels. Polyester fibers by nature are petroleum-based. So you're using a lot of resources even trying to manufacture the fiber. You can manufacture polyester out of recycled bottles. This currently is about 14% of the market. It's not very widespread in use just because the technology is somewhat limiting. My theory is that over the next couple of years, in 10 years or so, as we start limiting more and more of our natural resources, that this market will increase. They are looking at things like bio-based synthetics, which would be creating polyester from different sources. However, this is still in its infancy. Again, technology has not been a huge focus within the apparel industry. I suspect as our resources for fossil fuels continues to dwindle, this will become an area where within the apparel industry that companies will start focusing more. One of the interesting things that I've actually run up against in the last year within our company is that polyester does shed during laundering. So while it's got all these great kind of wash fastness properties, one of the new things that has come out is that this polyester does shed during laundry. It sheds microplastic fibers. Fibers do not wash out during wastewater treatment, and they cannot be blocked by washing machines. So eventually all this water with all these little tiny micro fibers will make its way into waterways, into oceans, or to drinking waters. There are some states that are starting to react to this, and this is something we ran up against with my company in the last year. There is current legislation that is routing in New York, California, and Connecticut about requiring suppliers to label garments that have more than 50% polyester with a visible product marking, either hang tag or sticker, to educate the consumer that product does shed during laundering. The legislation has stalled since, I want to say, about August of last year. This legislation is similar to the 2015 microbead legislation that President Obama put into place, which outlawed microbeads in bath products. Although it would not outlaw polyester as a fiber, it would require companies to educate their consumers. The American Apparel and Footwear Association and companies in general are very much fighting against this because there is concern that the customer will not understand what this means. There's also not a definitive definition as to how much polyester is released during shedding or during the washing. So that is still to be determined. However, U.S. legislation is starting to look into these kind of things. Organic cotton also is something that's often cited as a potential, alternative and sustainable fiber. The problem with organic cotton is that it's typically marketed to a higher demographic of customer, and that customer requires a higher grade of product. And with these, you have increased chemicals in the water. You have finer yarns. You're using more softeners. You're also increasing the use of dye and water and processing time in order to have good color fastness properties. Also, non-GMO cotton produces a less yield with an increased amount of water, so you still require a large amount of water to process this organic cotton. It also goes through the same processes on the back end that traditional cotton would as well. The big difference with non-GMO cotton is that you're getting a smaller yield with an increased amount of water being used. There is some recycled fabrics technology that's kind of going on. However, this is less than a percent of a percent at this point, primarily because there's not really any technological advances in this area at this point. Because garments are made up of multiple fibers, it's really difficult to get these fibers separated from their dyes. You also have difficulty separating individual, spandex versus the polyester. Garments have multiple types of fabrics. Recycled materials at this point really are just being used primarily for fiber or stuffing. So not a whole lot of advancements in that area. I do go into a little bit about chemicals and dyes and kind of how we got to this point. Chemicals and dyes are designed to be to resist biodegradation. They have a resistance to light, resistance to water. We require permanent press, antimicrobial. So all of these dyes that we've worked with over the last several years. They're designed not to break down in the environment, so therefore it becomes more and more difficult to get them out of the wastewater effluent. Environmental legislation versus gross domestic product or production. This is a very tricky one because there is no one governing body. Each company has its own sovereignty, so each country gets to decide what is their environmental kind of legislation and requirements. Environmental and social legislation are often in direct contact with an increase in GDP. Countries that are developing are, they often go to apparel manufacturing as a means to develop because it's cheap. You don't require a high-skilled workforce like you do in technology sectors. They're relatively easy to set up. Therefore, apparel often becomes kind of a gateway, if you will, into other advancing sectors. With that, you have a lot of pollutants that come along with that. So countries have to balance that GDP when looking at environmental regulations, and that can be very difficult because as you start putting more and more environmental regulations in place, it becomes more and more expensive to produce. If you look at what China has done in the last 8 to 10 years, they've really tried to balance that GDP growth with environmental regulations, primarily because as developing countries start to become developed, their individuals require more of their governments in terms of health, welfare, and safety. And one of those comes with a better environment. Individuals start demanding better living conditions, and that comes in the form of environmental health as well. China, for example, has had environmental regulations in place since 1989. However, they were very loosely enforced, if they were enforced at all. This kind of started changing in 2014 when China made changes to that impacted the oversight and enforcement. So they really changed who was able to be brought forth. In 2015, they increased the likelihood that individuals would be charged by increasing where or who the people are that could actually bring forth charges. In 2016, they put environmental legislation in the power of the province rather than the state. And so they required individual areas to report what environmental impacts they were making, and they created environmental protection plans and signed the Paris Accord. In 2017, China had their largest sweeping environmental impact where they actually forced factories to close, and there was around 800,000 individuals or factories that they either fined, closed, or put in jail. So they have kind of tightened up their environmental impacts, and this has caused some textile mills and factories to actually close. So how do we kind of start changing things? First off, I don't know that the apparel industry itself is going to do much of the changing. If consumers are really the ones that it kind of has to start with. Consumers really have to review their purchasing power. As consumers, we really have to slow purchasing as an entertainment and do it more out of necessity. If we do that, we then kind of send a message with our wallet, per se, to the companies that we are looking for change. Consumers also can start looking for more sustainable fibers through rayon or tencel or lyocell. All of these are plant-based fibers that are reconstituted through wood pulp. Tencel and lyocell come from eucalyptus. Rayon is made out of wood pulp. So by going to those, they're a little bit more easily replenishable. We can also limit our laundry use, meaning that we don't wash our clothes as much. Limiting laundry means that you're not using as much water or resources. It also preserves the lifespan of your garment. And then the additional Consumers really should be educated on how their clothing is truly made and what actually goes into that $5, $10 t-shirt, because I don't believe the average consumer really kind of understands what that low-cost garment really does to the environment. There has to be a global call to action by retailers and consumers. Otherwise, very little change will occur, which is kind of scary to think about. But once individuals start really paying attention with what they're really buying and what that's doing, you can start seeing some kind of impactful change. The flip side is that there will be an impact to the overall economic health because people won't be buying as much. But we have to weigh in the end, what is really the best? Is it going to be to continue the retail health, or is it going to be to put the focus on using less resources in the manufacturing process?